72,800 tons. That is how much the largest battleship ever constructed by human hands weighed when fully loaded and ready for war. To put that in perspective, imagine stacking more than 700 fully loaded freight trains on a single vessel, and then asking that vessel to move through open ocean at 27 knots. The Yamato was not simply a warship, it was the physical embodiment of an entire nation's belief that sheer overwhelming power, concentrated into a single object, could decide the fate of an empire. And the tragedy that makes this story unlike any other in naval history is that by the time the Yamato was finished, the world had already changed so fundamentally that everything it represented was already obsolete. The largest, most powerful, most heavily armored battleship ever built would sail into its final battle without air cover, without a realistic mission, and without any reasonable expectation of return, carrying with it the last breath of a strategic doctrine that had ruled the oceans for 4 centuries. To understand why Japan built the Yamato, you have to understand the math problem that kept Japanese naval planners awake at night throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Japan was an island nation with roughly half the industrial capacity of the United States. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Naval Treaty attempted to freeze the balance of naval power by imposing strict limits on the tonnage and armament of capital ships. Under those treaties, Japan was allowed a ratio of 3 capital ships for every 5 built by the United States or Britain. Japanese admirals understood what that ratio meant in plain terms. In any prolonged naval war, the United States could simply outbuild them. If both nations constructed battleships of equal quality, America would always have more. The arithmetic was merciless and inescapable, and it haunted the Imperial Japanese Navy like a recurring nightmare. So the Japanese naval leadership arrived at a conclusion that was as logical as it was audacious. If they could not match America in quantity, they would surpass it in quality. They would build individual ships so powerful, so heavily armed and armored, that each one would be worth 2 or 3 of anything the Americans could put to sea. The Yamato was the answer to that equation. The decision to build what would become the Yamato class was formalized in the mid-1930s, during a period when Japan was rapidly withdrawing from the international treaty system. Japan formally left the Naval Limitation Framework in 1936, freeing its designers to think without constraint. The Naval General Staff issued a requirement that read almost like a fantasy. They wanted a battleship that could engage and destroy any enemy vessel at ranges beyond what the enemy could effectively return fire. They wanted armor thick enough to withstand hits from the largest guns afloat. They wanted speed sufficient to dictate the terms of engagement. And above all, they wanted guns so massive that no existing or planned warship on Earth could match their destructive power. The designers at the Kure Naval Arsenal, led by a team of brilliant engineers, took that impossible brief and turned it into steel. What they produced was a ship that exceeded every parameter the admirals had asked for and redefined what a warship could be. Construction of the Yamato began on November 4, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal in Hiroshima Prefecture, and the secrecy surrounding the project was extraordinary, even by wartime standards. The Japanese government classified every detail of the ship's existence with a paranoia that bordered on the obsessive. Workers at the shipyard were subjected to intense background checks. The dry dock where the Yamato was being built was screened with massive sisal rope curtains and camouflage netting to prevent observation from the surrounding hills. Aerial photography of the area was strictly prohibited. Workers were forbidden from discussing any aspect of their work, even with family members. Different construction teams were deliberately kept ignorant of what other teams were building, so that no single group of workers could piece together a complete picture of the ship. Mail from the shipyard was censored, the roads around Kure were monitored. Even the railway cars that brought the massive steel plates and armor components to the yard were covered and moved at night whenever possible. The level of operational security was so extreme that many Japanese citizens, and indeed many officers within the Imperial Japanese Navy itself, did not know the Yamato existed until well into the war. In a nation that was building its entire strategy around this ship, the ship itself was a ghost. The physical dimensions of the Yamato are where the story moves from impressive to almost incomprehensible. The ship measured 263 meters from bow to stern, making it longer than 2.5 football fields laid end to end. Its beam, the widest point of the hull, was just under 39 meters, meaning it was too wide to fit through the Panama Canal, a fact that Japanese designers actually considered an advantage, since it meant American shipyards on the Atlantic coast could not quickly deploy comparable vessels to the Pacific. The draft, the depth of hull below the waterline, reached nearly 11 meters when fully loaded. The hull displaced 65,000 tons standard and reached that staggering 72,800 tons at full combat load. To give you a sense of what that means in comparison, the largest American battleships of the era, the Iowa class, displaced approximately 58,000 tons fully loaded. The Yamato outweighed them by nearly 15,000 tons, the equivalent of adding an entire heavy cruiser on top of an already massive battleship. But the true defining feature of the Yamato was not its size. It was its main armament. The ship carried 9 Type 94 naval guns arranged in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. Each gun measured 18.1 inches in caliber, or 460 millimeters. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship in the history of the world, and no gun of equal size has been built since. Each barrel was over 21 meters long and weighed approximately 165 tons by itself. A single turret, containing 3 of these guns along with its rotating mechanism, ammunition handling equipment and armor protection, weighed approximately 2,700 tons. That means each turret alone weighed more than many destroyers of the era. The shells fired by these guns came in 2 primary types. The armor-piercing shell weighed 1,460 kilograms, roughly the weight of a small car, and could be hurled to a maximum range of 42 kilometers, which is roughly the distance from the center of Manhattan to the far end of Long Island's Nassau County. At combat ranges of 20 to 30 kilometers, these shells could penetrate over 400 millimeters of steel armor, enough to punch through the protection of any battleship ever built. The high-explosive shells were lighter, but carried a devastating blast charge designed to obliterate anything above the waterline. When these guns fired a full broadside, all 9 barrels discharging simultaneously, the combined weight of metal leaving the ship in a single moment was over 13,000 kilograms, and the shockwave was powerful enough to strip paint from the deck, blow unsecured objects overboard, and cause physical injury to crew members who were not properly braced. The secondary armament was equally formidable by any standard. The Yamato carried 12 6.1-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, positioned along the sides of the superstructure. These guns were originally designed as main battery weapons for light cruisers, and mounting them as secondaries on a battleship underscored just how far beyond normal parameters the Yamato existed. In addition, the ship bristled with anti-aircraft weaponry that grew increasingly dense as the war progressed and the threat from the air became impossible to ignore. By the time of its final sortie in 1945, the Yamato carried over 150 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, including dozens of the rapid-firing 25mm Type 96 guns that studded every available surface of the superstructure like steel thorns. The ship also carried 6-inch anti-aircraft guns and numerous machine gun positions, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to throw up a wall of metal against incoming aircraft. Yet despite this staggering concentration of anti-aircraft firepower, the fundamental problem remained. The 25mm guns that formed the backbone of Japanese anti-aircraft defense were individually weak, lacked effective fire control systems, and were fed by 15-round magazines that required constant reloading, creating dangerous gaps in fire precisely when continuous shooting was most critical. The armor scheme of the Yamato was perhaps the single most impressive engineering achievement in the history of warship construction. The designers operated under a principle that the ship must be able to withstand hits from guns, as powerful as its own. Since the Yamato carried 18-inch guns, it needed armor capable of stopping 18-inch shells, a requirement that had never been attempted before and has never been attempted since. The main belt armor, the thick wall of steel protecting the ship's vital spaces along the waterline, was 410 millimeters thick, inclined at an angle of 20 degrees from the vertical. This inclination was critical because it effectively increased the thickness that an incoming shell had to penetrate by forcing it to travel through the plate at an angle rather than straight through. The result was an effective protection equivalent to over 500 millimeters of vertical armor. The armored deck, protecting the ship from plunging fire at long range and from aerial bombs, was 230 millimeters thick over the magazines and 200 millimeters over the machinery spaces. The turret faces carried 650 millimeters of armor, making them virtually impervious to any weapon in existence. The conning tower, where the captain and senior officers directed the ship in battle, was protected by 500 millimeters of armor on all sides. The total weight of armor on the Yamato exceeded 23,000 tons, which meant that the armor alone weighed more than many heavy cruisers of the era weighed in their entirety. The ship was in essence a floating fortress, wrapped in steel so thick that the designers genuinely believed nothing afloat could sink it through gunfire alone. The propulsion system required to move this colossus through the water at competitive speeds was a masterwork of marine engineering. The Yamato was powered by 12 Campon boilers feeding 4 steam turbines, which together produced approximately 150,000 shaft horsepower. This enormous power was transmitted to 4 propeller shafts, each driving a massive propeller. The result was a top speed of 27 knots, which translates to roughly 50 kilometers per hour. While this was slightly slower than the American Iowa-class battleships, which could reach 33 knots, it was considered adequate for the Yamato's intended tactical role as the centerpiece of a battle line engagement. The ship carried over 6,000 tons of fuel oil, giving it an operational range of approximately 7,200 nautical miles at an economical cruising speed of 16 knots. To run all of these systems and to fight the ship in combat required a crew of approximately 2,500 officers and enlisted men, a population equivalent to a small town, all living and working inside a steel hull that vibrated with the constant thrum of machinery, smelled of oil and sweat and salt, and offered its inhabitants almost no privacy, little comfort, and the ever-present knowledge that they served aboard the most valuable and most targeted ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Yamato was launched on August 8, 1940, in a ceremony so secret that even the traditional bottle of champagne was omitted to avoid drawing attention. The ship slid into the water at Kura with almost no fanfare, a giant born in silence. Fitting out continued through the following year, and the Yamato was officially commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into the Second World War. The timing was laden with irony that would only become apparent later. The very attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific and give the Yamato the battlefield conditions it was designed to dominate had actually demonstrated the principle that would make the Yamato irrelevant. Pearl Harbor proved that aircraft launched from carriers could devastate a fleet of battleships from hundreds of miles away without the attacking ships ever coming within gun range. The Japanese Navy had just proven, with devastating effectiveness, that the age of the battleship was over. And yet the Yamato, the ultimate expression of battleship supremacy, had just entered service. The first years of the Yamato's operational career were characterized by a paradox that frustrated the ship's crew and puzzled outside observers. Despite being the most powerful warship in the world, the Yamato spent most of its time anchored at the massive naval base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands, serving as the flagship of the combined fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief who had himself planned the Pearl Harbor attack, used the Yamato as his floating headquarters. The ship's luxurious officers' quarters, spacious flag bridge, and advanced communications equipment made it ideal for this role. But the crew found the assignment deeply unsatisfying. While other ships fought and died across the Pacific, the Yamato sat at anchor, its enormous guns silent, its crew growing restless. The sailors of the combined fleet began referring to the Yamato by a bitter nickname. They called it the Hotel Yamato, mocking its comfortable accommodations and its apparent refusal to fight. The irony cut deep, because the reason the Yamato was being held back was precisely because it was too valuable to risk. Japanese naval doctrine had invested so much strategic importance in the ship that using it in battle carried the terrifying possibility of losing it, and losing the Yamato would be a blow not just to combat capability, but to national morale. So the most powerful weapon in the arsenal sat unused, guarded like a sacred relic, while the war raged on around it. The Yamato did sortie occasionally during this period, but always as part of larger fleet movements that kept it well away from direct combat. It was present at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, but positioned 300 miles behind the carrier strike force, far too distant to influence the catastrophic battle that cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. The ship's 18-inch guns, capable of destroying anything they could hit at ranges exceeding 40 kilometers, were utterly useless against an enemy that attacked from beyond visual range, using aircraft that could strike and withdraw before the Yamato even knew where to aim. Midway was the battle that should have forced a complete rethinking of the Yamato's role, but institutional inertia and the sunk cost of the ship's enormous construction investment made such a reassessment psychologically impossible for the Japanese high command. They had staked everything on the battleship concept, and admitting that the concept was wrong meant admitting that the strategic foundation of the Imperial Navy was built on sand. Throughout 1943, the Yamato continued to serve primarily as a flagship and mobile command center, shuttling between Truk, Kure, and other bases, while the defensive perimeter that Japan had established in the first months of the war was steadily eroded by American advances. The ship received periodic upgrades to its anti-aircraft armament as the threat from American carrier aircraft became increasingly acute. Additional 25mm guns were welded onto every available surface. Radar systems were installed and upgraded, and the crew drilled constantly on anti-aircraft procedures. But these modifications were fundamentally cosmetic. They addressed the symptoms of the Yamato's vulnerability without confronting the underlying disease, which was that a surface warship without adequate air cover was a target, not a weapon, in the new form of naval warfare that had emerged since 1941. The ocean had changed, the Yamato had not. The ship finally saw significant combat during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, though even here its role was limited. The engagement, which American pilots would later dub the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the lopsided destruction of Japanese aircraft, demonstrated once again that carrier aviation had become the decisive arm of naval power. Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft against the American fleet, and the vast majority were shot down by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire before they could deliver their attacks. The Yamato's massive guns were irrelevant to this aerial slaughter. The ship fired its anti-aircraft batteries when enemy aircraft came within range, but the decisive fighting happened far above and far beyond the reach of its primary armament. The battle cost Japan 3 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft, losses that effectively destroyed Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. The Yamato survived the engagement physically intact, but the strategic environment around it had been gutted. It was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 that the Yamato finally fired its main guns in anger against enemy surface ships, and the circumstances were both dramatic and deeply revealing of the war's trajectory. Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history by the number of ships involved, a sprawling engagement fought across multiple days and hundreds of miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy committed virtually everything it had left in a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet off the Philippines. The plan was complex, involving multiple decoy forces and a central thrust through the San Bernardino Strait by a powerful surface force that included the Yamato, the Musashi, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. This force, designated Center Force and commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was supposed to break through to the invasion beaches and destroy the vulnerable transport and landing ships that were pouring American troops onto Philippine soil. If successful, the attack could set back the American campaign by months and buy Japan desperately needed time. The approach of Center Force through the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th became one of the most devastating demonstrations of air power against surface ships that the war had yet produced. American carrier aircraft found Kurita's force and attacked it relentlessly throughout the day. The Musashi, the Yamato's sister ship and the only other vessel of its class, bore the brunt of the assault. Over the course of approximately 5 hours, the Musashi absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, a punishment that would have sunk any other warship many times over. The Musashi's armor, identical to the Yamato's, held far longer than anyone had a right to expect. The ship continued fighting and moving for hours after sustaining damage that should have been immediately fatal, but eventually, the cumulative flooding overwhelmed even that incredible structural resilience, and the Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. The Yamato itself was hit by several bombs during the Sibuyan Sea attacks, but suffered only moderate damage, a testament to its extraordinary armor but also a matter of luck, since the American pilots had concentrated their attention on the Musashi. The loss of the Musashi was a shattering blow, not just for its military value, but for the psychological message it delivered. If the Musashi, one of the 2 most heavily protected warships ever built, could be sunk by air attack, then nothing afloat was safe. Admiral Kurita, shaken by the loss of the Musashi and uncertain about what lay ahead, temporarily reversed course, leading to confusion among both Japanese and American commanders about his intentions. But he turned back and pushed through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, emerging into the Philippine Sea on the morning of October 25th to find something completely unexpected. Due to a catastrophic failure of communication and coordination on the American side, the powerful battleship force that was supposed to be guarding the strait had been lured away by a Japanese decoy force of nearly empty carriers to the north. What lay between Kurita's massive surface force and the defenseless invasion beaches was a collection of small escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts designated Taffy 3, a force so outmatched that the engagement that followed almost defies belief. When the Yamato's lookouts spotted the American ships on the morning of October 25th, the crew could scarcely believe their fortune. Here, at last, was the surface engagement the ship had been built for. The Yamato opened fire with its 18-inch guns for the first time in combat against enemy warships, its enormous barrels hurling those 1,400-kilogram shells across miles of ocean toward the American escorts. The shells from the Yamato's guns were color-coded with dye markers, so that spotters could identify which ship's splashes were whose in a fleet engagement, and the Yamato's shells sent up enormous pink and red columns of water that towered over the small American vessels like geysers from another world. But what should have been a slaughter became one of the most remarkable defensive stands in naval history. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, ships that weighed less than 1/40th of the Yamato, charged directly at the Japanese battle line, laying smoke screens, firing torpedoes, and even blazing away with their 5-inch guns at ships they had no realistic chance of damaging. The escort carriers launched every aircraft they had, some armed with nothing more than depth charges and machine gun ammunition, because there had been no time to load proper anti-ship ordnance. Pilots made dry runs on the Japanese ships after exhausting their ammunition, diving at the superstructures of battleships and cruisers with empty guns just to force the Japanese gunners to take evasive action. The Battle off Samar, as this engagement became known, lasted approximately 2.5 hours, and the Yamato's performance during it revealed both the awe-inspiring power and the fundamental limitations of the battleship in the modern naval battlefield. The ship's 18-inch guns fired armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate the thick belt armor of enemy battleships. But the American escort carriers and destroyers were so lightly built that the massive shells often passed completely through their thin hulls without detonating, punching clean holes through both sides of a ship and flying out the other end without triggering their fuses. The shells were designed to explode after penetrating heavy armor, and the unarmored American ships simply did not provide enough resistance to activate the fusing mechanism. The most powerful naval guns ever built were, in a bitter irony, too powerful for the targets they were firing at. Meanwhile, the Yamato was forced into evasive maneuvers by torpedo attacks from the charging American destroyers, and at one critical point, the ship turned away from an incoming torpedo spread and steamed north for nearly 10 minutes to avoid the weapons, taking it progressively farther from the battle. By the time Kurita could re-engage, the situation had become confused, his force was scattered, and the ferocity of the American resistance had convinced him that he was facing a much larger force than he actually was. In one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War, Kurita broke off the attack and withdrew, having come within striking distance of the invasion beaches, but never reaching them. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf left the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force in name only. The diversionary force of carriers to the north had been destroyed. The southern force had been annihilated in a night battle at Surigao Strait. Center force, including the Yamato, had withdrawn without accomplishing its mission. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers in the battle, along with approximately 10,500 sailors. The Imperial Navy would never again mount a major fleet operation. The Yamato survived, but it survived into a world where there was almost nothing left for it to do. It returned to Japan and anchored at Kure, where it sat through the winter of 1944 to 1945, while the strategic situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. American B-29 bombers were firebombing Japanese cities. Submarines had strangled the supply lines that brought oil, food, and raw materials to the home islands. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima was under assault. And the next target on the American advance was Okinawa, an island close enough to the Japanese mainland that its capture would put the home islands within range of short-range fighters and medium bombers. The endgame was approaching, and everyone who could read a map knew it. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and fatalism that the Yamato received its final orders, and the story of Operation Tengo is one of the most haunting episodes in the entire history of warfare. In early April 1945, as American forces began their assault on Okinawa, the Japanese High Command decided to send the Yamato on a one-way mission to the island. The plan, such as it was, called for the Yamato to beach itself on the coast of Okinawa and use its massive guns as a stationary shore battery, firing on the American invasion force until it was destroyed. The ship was given only enough fuel for a one-way trip, approximately 2,500 tons of oil, though the actual amount loaded may have been somewhat more due to the actions of fuel depot officers who quietly added extra oil beyond what orders specified. The Yamato would be accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, a pitifully small escort for a ship of its importance. There would be no air cover. Japanese naval aviation had been effectively destroyed, and what few aircraft remained were being reserved for kamikaze operations against the American fleet. The Yamato was being sent to die. The reaction among the ship's officers and crew when they learned the nature of the mission was complex and has been the subject of extensive historical examination. Some accounts describe a fatalistic acceptance, even a grim enthusiasm, rooted in the warrior culture of Bushido and the conviction that a glorious death in service to the emperor was the highest possible achievement. Other accounts, including those of surviving crew members interviewed after the war, paint a more nuanced picture. Many of the younger sailors were terrified. Many of the officers understood perfectly well that the mission was militarily pointless, that the Yamato would be sunk by air attack long before it reached Okinawa, and that thousands of men would die for nothing more than a gesture. There was anger, confusion, and quiet despair aboard the ship in those final days. But there was also a sense that the Navy owed the nation one final act of sacrifice, that the Yamato could not be allowed to sit in harbor and be destroyed by bombs without ever fighting. That if the ship was going to die, it should die moving forward, guns blazing in a manner consistent with the traditions of the service. The logic was not military. It was spiritual, cultural, and emotional, and it speaks to the immense psychological weight that the Yamato carried as a symbol of Japanese national identity and martial spirit. The crew was given the opportunity to disembark if they chose, and a small number of men, primarily those with critical skills needed elsewhere, or those with family obligations that the Navy recognized, were removed from the ship. But the vast majority stayed. On the evening of April 6, 1945, the Yamato weighed anchor and steamed out of Tokuyama Naval Port on the inland sea, heading south toward the Bungo Channel and the open Pacific beyond. The weather was overcast, and the great ship moved through the grey water like a steel mountain, its superstructure looming against the low clouds, its massive gun turrets trained fore and aft, its deck crowded with the extra anti-aircraft guns that had been bolted on in a last-ditch effort to give the ship some chance of surviving the air attacks that everyone aboard knew were coming. The crew went to battle stations, and many wrote final letters home, sealed them, and left them with the limited number of personal effects that would be transferred off the ship if opportunity allowed. Some men shaved their heads in accordance with the samurai tradition of preparing for death. Others prayed. Others simply stood at their stations and stared at the darkening sea. American intelligence knew the Yamato was coming almost before the ship cleared the harbor. Submarine patrols and signals intelligence had been tracking Japanese fleet movements with increasing precision throughout the war, and the sortie of the largest battleship in the world was not something that could be hidden. The submarine's Threadfin and Hackleback spotted the Japanese force as it transited the Bungo Channel and transmitted contact reports that reached Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding the American Fifth Fleet within hours. Spruance initially considered sending his own battle line of fast battleships to intercept the Yamato in a surface engagement, and for a brief, tantalizing moment, the prospect of a battleship versus battleship clash between the most powerful ships of two nations flickered into possibility. But Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the Fast Carrier Task Force, requested and received permission to handle the Yamato with air power alone. The decision was practical and coldly efficient. Why risk battleships and their crews in a gun duel with the most heavily armed vessel afloat when you could destroy it from the air without ever coming within range of those terrifying 18-inch guns? The answer, of course, was that you would not. The age of the battleship was over, and the Yamato's final battle would prove it beyond any remaining doubt. The morning of April 7th, 1945, dawned with scattered clouds and moderate seas. The Yamato and its escorts were steaming southwest of Kyushu, still several hundred miles from Okinawa, when American reconnaissance aircraft found them shortly after dawn. The sighting reports triggered an immediate response from the carrier task force. Beginning at approximately 10 in the morning, Mitcher launched a series of massive airstrikes totaling nearly 400 aircraft, a force of Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers, that darkened the sky as they formed up and headed north toward the Japanese ships. The first wave arrived over the Yamato at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, and what followed over the next 2 hours was a systematic, methodical destruction of the most powerful warship the world had ever seen. The Japanese force fought back with everything it had. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened fire at maximum range, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracer rounds that created a visual spectacle of terrifying beauty. The light cruiser Yahagi and the destroyers added their own fire, and for a few minutes, the incoming American aircraft had to fly through a curtain of steel that was genuinely dangerous. Several American planes were hit and went down, but the sheer number of attacking aircraft overwhelmed the defenders almost immediately. The American pilots had been briefed to concentrate their torpedo attacks on the port side of the Yamato, a tactic designed to cause asymmetric flooding that would create a progressive list that the ship's damage control teams could not correct. This was a lesson learned from the sinking of the Musashi, where torpedo hits distributed evenly on both sides had allowed damage control to counter-flood and keep the ship relatively stable for hours. By concentrating on one side, the attackers ensured that the flooding would be unbalanced from the very beginning, and the cumulative effect would be catastrophic. The first torpedo struck the Yamato at approximately 12:43, hitting the port side amidships and blowing a massive hole in the hull below the waterline. Within minutes, a second and third torpedo hit the same side, and the ship began to develop a noticeable list to port. Damage control teams fought desperately to counter-flood the starboard compartments, pumping seawater into undamaged sections of the hull to try to balance the ship, a measure that kept the vessel upright but added thousands of tons of additional weight that reduced freeboard and made the ship sit lower in the water. Dive bombers scored hits on the superstructure and deck, killing anti-aircraft gunners and destroying fire control equipment. One bomb penetrated the aft secondary gun turret and detonated inside, killing the entire crew and starting fires that added thick black smoke to the chaos already enveloping the ship. The Yamato's after-fire control director was destroyed, blinding the aft anti-aircraft batteries and forcing them to fire under local control, which was far less accurate. The second wave of American aircraft arrived while the first was still pressing its attack, creating a continuous assault that gave the Yamato's crew no respite. More torpedoes slammed into the port side, and the list increased steadily despite frantic counter-flooding. The ship's speed dropped as flooding reached the boiler rooms, knocking out several of the 12 boilers and reducing power to the turbines. The Yamato, which had been making 22 knots when the attack began, slowed to 18, then 15, then 12. Each reduction in speed made the ship an easier target and reduced its ability to maneuver away from torpedo tracks. The port side was now a shattered wall of torn steel, and seawater was pouring into the hull through holes that no amount of damage control could seal. Crew members in the lower compartments drowned at their stations as the water rose around them, trapped behind watertight doors that had been sealed to prevent further flooding from spreading. A necessary measure that saved the ship temporarily, but condemned the men behind those doors to certain death. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Yamato had absorbed an estimated 10 torpedo hits and 7 bomb hits, though exact numbers vary between sources because the intensity of the attack made precise accounting impossible. The list to port had reached approximately 15 to 20 degrees, a critical angle that made it increasingly difficult for the crew to move, fight, or operate the ship's systems. The main gun turrets could no longer train effectively because the list threw off their leveling mechanisms. The anti-aircraft guns on the starboard side were pointing increasingly toward the sky, while those on the port side were depressed toward the water, creating huge gaps in the defensive fire. Fires raged across the superstructure, and thick smoke mixed with steam from ruptured pipes reduced visibility inside the ship to nearly zero in many areas. The order was given to counterflood additional starboard compartments, and for a brief moment the list decreased slightly. But a fresh wave of torpedo hits on the port side immediately overwhelmed this correction and pushed the list past 20 degrees. What happened next has been reconstructed from the accounts of the survivors, and the picture they paint is one of unimaginable chaos and horror. As the list increased past 25 degrees, the Yamato began to lose all semblance of controlled operation. Men slid across sloping decks into bulkheads and machinery. Ammunition broke free from its storage racks and tumbled through compartments. The ship's massive hull groaned and shrieked as structural members took loads they were never designed to bear. At approximately 2:05 in the afternoon, with the list approaching 30 degrees and the ship clearly doomed, the order to abandon ship was given. But abandoning a ship the size of the Yamato while it is listing heavily under continuous air attack, with fires burning and explosions occurring throughout the hull, is not a simple matter of jumping into the water. Thousands of men tried to reach the open deck from interior compartments through passageways that were now steeply inclined, partially flooded, filled with smoke and littered with debris and bodies. Many never made it. Those who reached the deck found themselves on a surface tilting so steeply that they could not stand and had to slide or crawl toward the water. Some jumped and were pulled under by the suction of the sinking hull. Others were struck by debris or caught in the blast of continuing explosions. At 2:05 in the afternoon, approximately 2 hours after the first torpedo hit, the Yamato rolled completely over to port, exposing the enormous red-painted bottom of its hull to the sky. And then, in one of the most tremendous explosions of the entire war, the ship's forward magazines detonated. The blast was so powerful that it sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and flame over 6 kilometers into the sky. A column of destruction visible from the island of Kyushu, over 200 kilometers away. The explosion was reportedly heard on the coastline and registered on seismographic equipment. The detonation of thousands of tons of 18-inch shells, propellant charges, and smaller ammunition created a fireball that incinerated everything within hundreds of meters. The ship broke apart and sank in approximately 340 meters of water, carrying with it an estimated 3,055 of its crew. Only 276 men survived. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers were also sunk during the engagement. The total Japanese death toll from Operation Tengo exceeded 4,000 sailors. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The mathematics of that final exchange tell the story of the Yamato more eloquently than any narrative could. The most expensive, most powerful, most heavily armored warship in human history, crewed by thousands of men, and mounting the largest guns ever put to sea, was destroyed in 2 hours by aircraft launched from ships that never came within 200 miles of it. The Yamato never saw its attackers' ships. Its 18-inch guns, capable of hurling shells over 40 kilometers, never fired at a surface target during the engagement because there were no surface targets to fire at. The weapon that was supposed to be the ultimate expression of naval power was rendered completely irrelevant by a form of warfare that operated in a dimension the weapon could not reach. The Yamato could destroy anything on the surface of the ocean. But the attack came from the sky, and against the sky those massive guns were useless. The story of the Yamato is often told as a tragedy of hubris, and there is truth in that reading. The Imperial Japanese Navy invested an enormous portion of its limited industrial capacity in building 2 super battleships that proved unable to influence the outcome of the war. The resources consumed by the Yamato and Musashi in terms of steel, labor, engineering talent, and time could have been directed toward building aircraft carriers, submarines, or the aircraft and trained pilots that Japan needed far more desperately. The decision to build the Yamato class was rooted in a strategic doctrine that was already being overtaken by technological change at the moment the keels were laid. In this sense, the Yamato represents one of the most spectacular misallocations of military resources in modern history, a triumph of engineering in service of an obsolete idea. But there is another way to read the Yamato's story, one that does not reduce it to a cautionary tale about technological stubbornness. The ship was built by a nation that understood, with painful clarity, that it could not match its most likely adversary in an industrial war of attrition. Japanese planners were not fools. They knew they were outmatched in shipyard capacity, steel production, oil reserves, and manpower. The Yamato was their attempt to solve an unsolvable problem through engineering excellence, to create a qualitative advantage so overwhelming that it could offset a quantitative disadvantage that was structural and permanent. The tragedy is not that they tried. The tragedy is that the nature of warfare changed so rapidly that even a perfect solution to the old problem was worthless against the new one. The Yamato was the best answer to a question that the world had stopped asking. The wreck of the Yamato was located in 1985, resting on the seabed of the East China Sea at a depth of approximately 340 meters. Subsequent surveys using unmanned submersibles have revealed that the ship lies in 2 main sections, broken apart by the catastrophic magazine explosion. The bow section is inverted, lying upside down on the seabed, while the stern section rests nearby at a different angle. Debris is scattered across a wide area, and the sheer size of the wreckage field testifies to the violence of the ship's destruction. The Japanese government has designated the site as a war grave, and it is treated with the same reverence accorded to any resting place of fallen soldiers. The Yamato Museum in Kure, the city where the ship was built, houses a 1/10 scale model of the vessel that stretches over 26 meters, along with artifacts, documents, and exhibits that tell the story of the ship and its crew. The museum draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, many of them descendants of the men who served aboard the Yamato, and it serves as both a memorial and a meditation on the relationship between technological ambition, military power, and the human cost of war. The cultural impact of the Yamato in Japan extends far beyond the museum. The ship has become one of the most potent symbols in Japanese popular culture, appearing in films, television series, manga, anime, and video games, with a frequency and intensity that speaks to its deep resonance in the national psyche. The most famous of these cultural representations is the anime series Space Battleship Yamato, first broadcast in 1974, in which the sunken wreck of the battleship is raised, rebuilt as a spacecraft, and sent on an intergalactic mission to save humanity. The series was enormously popular and spawned multiple sequels, films, and remakes, and its central metaphor is transparently powerful. The Yamato, which failed in its historical mission and sank with most of its crew, is resurrected and given a second chance to succeed, this time not in service of empire, but in service of all humanity. The transformation from instrument of war to instrument of salvation speaks to Japan's post-war renegotiation of its identity, the desire to retain pride in the technical achievement and the courage of the crew while reframing the ship's meaning away from militarism and toward something more universal. The engineering legacy of the Yamato is worth contemplating separately from its military failure, because as a feat of naval architecture, the ship remains genuinely remarkable. The hull design incorporated innovations in welding technology, compartmentalization, and hydrodynamic efficiency that influenced warship construction for decades. The bulbous bow fitted to the Yamato, designed to reduce wave resistance and improve fuel efficiency, was one of the first applications of this now universal feature on a large warship. The armor scheme, while ultimately insufficient against massed air attack, was the most sophisticated ever devised for a surface vessel and represented the absolute pinnacle of passive protection technology. The main gun turrets were engineering marvels, capable of loading and firing shells weighing nearly 1.5 tons, with a cycle time of approximately 40 seconds, a rate of fire that was impressive given the enormous mass of metal being handled. The fire control system, while less advanced than the radar-directed systems used by American battleships later in the war, was among the most refined optical systems ever developed, capable of accurate ranging at distances exceeding 35 kilometers. Every system aboard the Yamato represented the best that Japanese engineering could achieve, and in many cases, it was world-class by any standard. The human stories embedded within the Yamato's history are what transform it from a narrative about steel and gunpowder into something genuinely moving. Consider the young sailors, many of them conscripts barely out of their teens, who were told they were joining the crew of the most powerful warship in the world, only to spend months or years sitting at anchor while the war ground on around them. Consider the damage control teams who fought flooding in pitch-dark compartments below the waterline during the ship's final battle, knowing they were in a sinking vessel, knowing the watertight doors behind them were sealed, knowing they would not be coming out. Consider the officers who understood the futility of Operation Tengo, but led their men into it anyway because duty and honor demanded nothing less. Consider the engine room crew who kept the turbines running even as the ship listed further and further, even as their compartments began to flood, even as the lights flickered and failed and the boilers threatened to explode from the shifting water levels. Consider the survivors, plucked from the cold water after the ship sank, who lived the rest of their lives carrying the weight of having survived when 3,000 of their shipmates did not. Every war produces stories like these, but the Yamato concentrates them with unusual intensity because the ship itself was so extraordinary that everything that happened aboard it takes on an amplified significance. The question of whether the Yamato should have been built at all is one that has occupied military historians since the end of the war, and it touches on one of the most fundamental challenges in military planning, which is the problem of preparing for the next war rather than the last one. The admirals who approved the Yamato class were not stupid men. They were highly trained professionals working within a strategic framework that had been validated by every major naval engagement since the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese fleet had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in a decisive surface action that proved the primacy of the big-gun battleship. For 40 years after Tsushima, every major navy in the world had built its strategy around the battleship, and the naval arms races that preceded both world wars were fundamentally about who could build the biggest, most numerous, and most heavily armed battle wagons. The aircraft carrier existed as a concept from the early 1920s onward, but it was regarded by most naval establishments as an auxiliary vessel, useful for scouting and harassment, but incapable of standing up to a battle line of modern dreadnoughts. The idea that aircraft could sink battleships was tested in controlled experiments, most notably the 1921 bombing tests conducted by American General Billy Mitchell against captured German warships, but the results were inconclusive enough that battleship advocates could dismiss them as unrealistic. The Japanese themselves were among the pioneers of carrier aviation, and it is one of the supreme ironies of the Pacific War that the same navy that built the Yamato also developed the operational doctrines and techniques that would make the Yamato obsolete. The Kido Butai, the fast carrier striking force that attacked Pearl Harbor, was the most formidable concentration of naval air power in the world at the time of its creation. And the tactics it employed, massed carrier strikes launched at extreme range against enemy fleet bases, were revolutionary. But even within the Japanese Navy, the carrier advocates and the battleship traditionalists coexisted uneasily, and the construction of the Yamato class represented a massive institutional bet on the traditionalist side. The failure to choose definitively between the two schools of thought, to either go all in on carriers or all in on battleships, meant that Japan did neither as well as it could have, spreading its limited resources across two competing strategic visions and achieving dominance in neither. What makes the Yamato's story universal rather than merely Japanese is that the pattern it represents is not unique to any one nation or era. Every military establishment in history has faced the same dilemma. The weapons and doctrines that produced victory in the last war may be irrelevant in the next one, but abandoning proven capabilities in favor of unproven innovations is a gamble that can be fatal if the innovations fail. The British built a massive investment in horse cavalry right up to the eve of the First World War, only to discover that machine guns and barbed wire had made mounted charges suicidal. The French built the Maginot Line, the most formidable system of fixed fortifications ever constructed, only to watch the Germans drive around it through Belgium. The Americans built thousands of nuclear bombers during the early Cold War, only to find that intercontinental ballistic missiles could deliver the same warheads faster, cheaper, and with less risk. In every case, the decision to build the obsolete system was not born of stupidity, but of a reasonable assessment of existing evidence that failed to account for the speed of technological change. The Yamato is the purest example of this pattern, because the gap between its conception and its obsolescence was so narrow, the investment was so enormous, and the consequences were so catastrophic. The fuel situation that constrained the Yamato's operations throughout its career deserves particular attention, because it illustrates how logistics, rather than combat, ultimately determines the fate of navies. Japan entered the war with limited oil reserves and depended heavily on imports from the Dutch East Indies, which it had seized in the opening months of the conflict. As the war progressed, American submarines increasingly targeted the tankers that carried this oil back to Japan, and by late 1944, the tanker fleet had been so decimated that Japan could no longer move adequate supplies of fuel oil from the production areas to the home islands. The Yamato consumed enormous quantities of fuel. At full speed, its 12 boilers burned through oil at a rate that would empty the tanks in a matter of days. Even at economical cruising speed, the ship's fuel consumption was prodigious. By the time of Operation Tengo, the fuel shortage was so severe that the Navy could only provide enough oil for a one-way trip. The most powerful warship ever built was killed not by enemy guns or bombs in the abstract sense, but by the absence of the oil it needed to function. It was logistics, not firepower, that wrote the final chapter. The comparison between the Yamato and its American counterparts reveals important truths about different approaches to industrial warfare. The Iowa-class battleships, the largest and most powerful built by the United States, were impressive vessels by any standard, displacing around 58,000 tons fully loaded and carrying 9 16-inch guns. But the American approach to naval power was fundamentally different from the Japanese approach. Where Japan concentrated its resources in a small number of supremely powerful individual ships, the United States built a balanced fleet of enormous breadth and depth. America produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers during the war, each one capable of operating over 90 aircraft. It built hundreds of destroyers, dozens of cruisers, and vast fleets of landing craft, supply ships, tankers, and support vessels. The Iowa-class battleships were excellent ships, but they were components of a system, not the system itself. The Yamato was designed to be the system, the single decisive weapon that would win the critical battle. The American approach was to build a military machine so broad and so deep that no single weapon, no matter how powerful, could cripple it. The contest between these two philosophies was decided not in a dramatic fleet engagement, but in the shipyards, factories, and oil fields that sustained the war effort, and the result was never really in doubt. Have you ever considered what it must have felt like to stand on the bridge of the Yamato on that final morning, knowing that the aircraft were coming, knowing that the mathematical certainty of what was about to happen was as absolute as the dawn, and choosing to stand there anyway? That moment, more than any specification or battle report, is where the real meaning of the Yamato lives. It is not a story about a ship. It is a story about human beings facing the consequences of decisions made years before by men in conference rooms far from the ocean, and accepting those consequences with a dignity that transcends the strategic folly that created the situation. The echoes of the Yamato extend into the modern era in ways that are both direct and philosophical. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the naval component of Japan's post-war military, has named several of its most prominent warships after ancient provinces in a tradition that consciously connects the modern service to historical roots. The helicopter destroyer Izumo, one of the largest warships in the JMSDF fleet, is roughly the same length as the Yamato but operates in a completely different paradigm, carrying helicopters and potentially fixed-wing stealth aircraft rather than massive guns. The evolution from the Yamato to the Izumo encapsulates the entire transformation of naval warfare over 80 years, from brute force concentrated in a single platform to distributed capability spread across networks of ships, aircraft, satellites, and data links. The Yamato could destroy anything within 40 kilometers. A modern carrier strike group can project power across thousands of kilometers, and its most potent weapons may be the information systems that allow it to find, track, and engage targets that the Yamato's crew could never have imagined. The philosophical lesson of the Yamato resonates in every field where organizations must decide between perfecting existing approaches and embracing disruptive change. In business, in technology, in education, in governance, the Yamato pattern repeats itself. Invest heavily in what worked before. Refine it, optimize it, build the biggest, most powerful version of it that engineering allows, and then watch in disbelief as a completely different approach, cheaper, lighter, more flexible, renders the entire investment irrelevant. The Yamato is the Kodak moment of naval warfare, the blockbuster video of military strategy, the taxi medallion of the high seas. The technology was not wrong. It was simply the right answer to a question that had ceased to be the one being asked. But the Yamato is also a monument to what human beings can achieve when they push engineering to its absolute limits. To design and build a ship of that size, with that level of armor protection, that weight of armament, and that degree of structural integrity, was an achievement that required mastery of metallurgy, hydrodynamics, mechanical engineering, weapons design, and industrial production at the highest level. The men who built the Yamato were among the most skilled naval architects and shipbuilders on Earth, and the ship they created was, by the standards of the problem it was designed to solve, flawless. It could do everything it was asked to do. It could withstand the punishment it was designed to withstand. It could deliver the firepower it was designed to deliver. The failure was not in the engineering. It was in the assumption that the problem would remain the same. The wreck of the Yamato lies on the seabed of the East China Sea today, a twisted mass of steel slowly being consumed by the ocean. Coral grows on its armor plates. Fish swim through compartments where men once worked, slept, ate, dreamed, and died. The 18-inch guns that were supposed to decide the fate of an empire lie buried in silt, their barrels pointed at nothing, their breeches open to the cold water. 3,055 men lie with the ship, their bodies long since returned to the elements, their names inscribed on memorials in Kuri and across Japan. They were mechanics and gunners, cooks and signalmen, officers and conscripts, old men and boys. They served aboard the largest warship ever built, and they died in its destruction. And the ocean that swallowed them is the same ocean that carries container ships and fishing boats and cruise liners today, oblivious to what rests below. The next time you look at an aircraft carrier on the news, or see a drone strike reported from a distant battlefield, or read about autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence reshaping the future of warfare. Remember the Yamato. Remember that there was a moment within living memory when the most powerful military minds of a great nation believed that the answer to the challenges of modern war was a bigger gun on a bigger ship with thicker armor. They were wrong, and the cost of being wrong was measured in thousands of lives and the fate of nations. But also remember this: the men who built the Yamato were not fools, and the men who sailed it were not victims. They were human beings, wrestling with uncertainty, making the best decisions they could with the information they had, and facing the consequences with a courage that deserves to be remembered long after the strategic debates have been settled. The Yamato was the wrong answer. But it was a magnificent wrong answer, and in its story we see reflected every decision, personal or national, where commitment to a failing course becomes indistinguishable from heroism. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about the Yamato and the forces that created it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We will see you in the next one.